Imagine you stand in the corridor outside the basement cells of Block 11 as keys scrape metal and a door seals with a rubbery thud. Zyklon B canisters have been carried down the stairwell. SS Deputy Commandant Karl Fritsch has set a new procedure in motion. Hours later, a sanitation detail of prisoners will be ordered to drag bodies up the stairs, hose the floor, and carry the dead to the crematorium. The line from that night leads directly to a system where prisoners are made to assist, and sometimes to kill, under threat. Block 11 sat inside the brick perimeter of Auschwitz I, a punitive block with window slits and a basement of standing cells used for starvation and confinement. The weather was late summer damp. Ventilation in the corridors was poor. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide distributed to the camp for delousing, arrived in embossed metal canisters from civilian suppliers contracted by the SS. That night, pellets were poured into sealed spaces below, through openings adapted for the test. The Schutzhaftlagerführer, Fritsch, controlled the timing. Guards marked doors and posted sentries while a courier fetched gas masks for the unlocking sequence. The victims were selected from two streams that converged after Operation Barbarossa. Soviet prisoners of war brought into the camp in 1941, and a group of Polish inmates drawn from punishment details. Estimates vary. Contemporaneous accounts and later testimony point to roughly 600 Red Army POWs and several hundred Polish prisoners over one or more nights in early September. The exact count for each night is disputed. What is clear is that the test worked, and that it was repeated until no one inside the basement cells was left alive. You follow the next step up the stairs, where mechanics of disposal became the first coerced template. After the air cleared to a level deemed safe by the SS, a prisoner work party was ordered below. They wore rags over their faces or nothing at all, and they moved bodies that had stiffened in cramped positions. The detail dragged the dead along the corridor, past drains set in concrete, and into the yard where a cart waited. The small brick crematorium known later as Crematorium I, equipped with top-built ovens, stood a short walk away across the roll call square. That night and the nights that followed, its hearths glowed longer. Reports from perpetrators and surviving prisoners align on procedure. SS with gas masks opened doors, checked for breathing, and, if a chest moved, ended it with a pistol shot. There is no credible evidence that prisoners were authorized that night to administer the final act. The SS kept the killing stroke. Prisoners did the handling, lifting, carrying, cleaning. Floors were washed with water and disinfectant. Smears were scrubbed into drains. The basement was aired to be used again. What happened in Block 11 did not remain a standalone experiment. Within weeks and months, the camp installed gas-tight doors and ventilation in Crematorium I. By 1942, the center of killing would shift to Birkenau, where purpose-built crematoria paired underground gas chambers with multi-muffle ovens and prisoner Sonderkommando units. The logic visible in embryo on 3 September 1941 hardened into workflow. The SS set the seal and held the weapon. Prisoners under threat moved the bodies, cleaned the rooms, and kept pace with the schedule. Microentries from the period trace the transformation. A requisition for additional Zyklon B canisters, a maintenance note on a fan, shifts assigned in the Schreibstube to sanitation details, a guard rotation for the punitive block. The record is sparse on names of the men who went down those stairs. Most were killed soon after or transferred without notation. The architecture of coercion, however, is legible. A pesticide became an instrument of mass murder. A punitive basement became a prototype. Prisoners were made to touch the results before anyone else, setting the pattern the system would expand until it covered a landscape. Rain needles the parade ground as the bell sounds, and you step onto the Appellplatz, triangles and numbers stiff with damp. SS guards scan faces and pluck men from ranks to become Blockeltest and Kapos, handing out armbands and sticks. A ledger page is updated in the Schreibstube. The labor shortage and the logic of control pushed the SS to delegate violence downward. From the cellar of Block 11, the machine extends into every barracks wing. The roll call stretches, boots sliding on cinders, wet wool steaming in the dawn. Color-coded triangles mark categories at a glance. Red for political, green for criminal, black for so-called asocial, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for men imprisoned as homosexuals. Jewish prisoners carry a yellow triangle paired with a second color to form a star. Numbers are checked against block lists. A guard's gloved hand points. A prisoner steps forward. An armband cut from white cloth with black letters is tied on, and a baton, rubber or wood, is issued. The selection is immediate and visible. Authority conveyed by a strip of fabric and the right to strike. In the Schreibstube, the camp writing room, a clerk copies names with a steel nib, prisoner numbers aligned under headings for Blockeltister, Stubeneltister, Capo, Schreiber. Carbon paper bleeds blue onto duplicate sheets. A stamp thuds purple into a corner. The entry changes rations, sleeping space, and exposure to guards. A prisoner made Lagereltister or Blockeltister receives slightly better clothing, extra soup, and access to rooms where orders move before they strike the yard. The same entry makes him responsible for counts, work pace, latrine discipline, and punishment under SS instruction. You watch the structure lock into place by function. Each barracks block has a Blockeltister, each room a Stubeneltister, each work detail a Capo and Vorarbeiter. The SS compound the hierarchy by favoring certain categories, often green triangle criminals in early Auschwitz, to enforce discipline over politicals, Jews, and others. In 1940-41, some of these men arrived transferred from Dachau and Sachsenhausen to cede control in a new camp. By 1942, the WVHA's Office D circulates procedures that regularize prisoner self-administration across the system. What began as an ad hoc solution on a wet parade ground becomes doctrine. The purpose is logistical. A few hundred SS and auxiliaries cannot micromanage tens of thousands spread across barracks, quarries, workshops, and fields. With armbands and sticks, the SS multiplies its reach. Refusal by a functionary to carry out an order leads to demotion to a penal company, a beating at the post, or assignment to a death-rate labor detail. Records note outcomes unevenly, and many specific cases are unknown. Compliance is built on immediate threat and calibrated reward. Small objects carry the weight of the system. A truncheon taps a bunk frame to wake a room. A chalkboard records a work detail's head count. A key turns on a box of bread loaves to be cut under watch. The same men who distribute rations prepare flogging posts, march columns, and assemble gallows platforms when ordered. From Block 11's basement upward, the division of labor established under gas and drain grates spreads through linen rooms, mess halls, and workshops, until every corridor carries an armband that can strike. The paper trail in the Schreibstube keeps pace, one line for each new hand enlisted to keep the machinery moving. A typed circular slides across a desk at the SS Economic Administrative Main Office, Office D. A purple stamp sinks into paper, routing prisoner self-administration across the camp network. Payroll, food allotments, punishment schedules. The bureaucracy turns coercion into forms and shifts. The policy hardens what began on a wet parade ground into procedure. With that paper trail, prisoner functionaries become structural levers, expendable but essential. In early 1942, the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps was folded into the WVHA, bringing the camps under the authority of Oswald Pohl and placing day-to-day regulation within Amtsgruppe D, headed by Richard Glucks. The change turned scattered practice into standardized rulebooks. Who counted whom at dawn, who issued tools, who signed for food cauldrons, how punishments were requested and logged. Sub-offices inside D handled labor allocation, medical and hygiene oversight, and administration. linking prisoner categories and work details to orders arriving from armaments ministries and SS enterprises. A circular did not swing a baton, it ensured that someone with an armband did. You follow the ink through a chain of paperwork that reaches into every barracks. The Schreibstube duplicates forms, personal cards, labor assignment slips, death notices, transport lists. Numbers are copied twice with carbon paper. A miswritten digit triggers a reprimand. Headcounts from the Appellplats flow into daily work statistics sheets that roll upward to DII, where staff translate them into quotas and replacement requests. The system positions Blockel test, Stubenel test, and Capos as the first link in the accounting chain, responsible for bodies on a line and names on a page. Economics locks into discipline. External firms contracting for prisoner labor, quarries under DESD, workshops under DAW, and other SS-linked ventures receive headcounts and work norms. The WVHA bills for shifts, not for lives. Food scales, issued as tables, calibrate rations by labor category, making calories conditional on output the capos are ordered to enforce. You see how a stick becomes an instrument of payroll. Work is pushed to meet a number that lives as a row on a report. Where output lags, punishment protocols are invoked, with requests for flogging or confinement filed by prisoner scribes, approved by SS officers, and witnessed by a camp doctor. The ledger makes violence legible and repeatable. The circulars also tighten movement and information. Transfers between camps are coordinated so that functionaries move with tasks. A trained capo from Dachau can be sent to Auschwitz to cede control, a clerk from Buchenwald to Lublin to set up the writing room. Office D disseminates uniform insignia rules and reporting hierarchies, so a Blockeltister in one lager reads the same paper trail as his counterpart elsewhere. The intention appears in the files: reduce friction, increase throughput, stabilize terror with forms. Unknown are many of the men whose names sit on these forms only as numbers and signatures. Their individual choices do not appear in the WVHA's neat columns. Known are the effects. A schedule assigns a sanitation team to a block after a punishment. A requisition orders more armbands and truncheons. A maintenance note fixes a door needed for a transport. The more complete the paperwork, the more obscured the human costs behind it. In this arrangement, prisoner functionaries become measurable assets and disposable buffers, kept just secure enough to transmit orders downward and absorb blame upward. Where policy meets walls, architecture follows. Amtsgruppe C, the WVHA's construction arm, draws up rooms for labor and for death. Tiled spaces with drains, posts set at regulation distances, beams fitted with hooks, corridors that allow a column to move in and an empty cart to roll out. Procedures from Office D dictate how they will be used and by whom. A blueprint can be read as an itinerary for the body. You step from the page into a corridor north of Berlin, where a measuring board is bolted to clean tile and a narrow slit hides behind it. The next memo runs not in lines of type, but along a wall at Sachsenhausen Station Z. You pass a measuring board bolted to white tile and a door with a narrow slit. A smell of carbolic rides the corridor in Sachsenhausen Station Z. The room looks like a medical station, but behind the measuring device is a hidden firing slit. SS executioners shoot through the wall in the back of the neck, while prisoner barbers and orderlies move victims through the line and remove bodies. The architecture makes killing a workflow. What began as ad hoc in a basement now runs as an assembly. Station Z, named without irony to signify the endpoint of a carefully organized process, operated at the far edge of the Sachsenhausen camp complex, near the crematorium. Officially designated as a Genickschussanlage, or neck-shooting installation, it mimicked a medical examination room. White tile walls, a measuring scale, overhead lighting, and shelves for clothing. The purpose was deception and efficiency. Victims were brought in under the guise of medical inspection, often not realizing what the room was until the bolt closed behind them. Execution followed a sequence. The victim stood against the measuring wall, facing forward, spine aligned with the board. A moment later, a shot fired from a concealed slit behind the fixture, point-blank to the base of the skull, typically using a small-caliber pistol or rifle fired by an SS man stationed in a sealed adjacent room. Logs and maintenance records show that the equipment was designed for mechanical precision and quick reset between victims. A drainage channel below the floor caught runoff. By 1942, this method had been refined and reproduced at other sites. You handle the next steps not as an observer but as a pressed participant. One of the Leichenarbeiter, corpse handlers, drawn from prisoner detail through direct orders. Barbers, also prisoners, were tasked with cutting hair and searching bodies for hidden items before or after execution. Other prisoners were ordered to strip the dead, load them onto carts, clean the tiles, and reset the site. Refusal risked immediate execution or transfer to punishment detail. Few functionaries in Station Z lasted more than weeks. Executions followed those who knew too much. The location and procedure served Operation 14F-13 as early as 1941, targeting political prisoners, the ill, and those deemed unfit across camps. Groups transferred from Buchenwald and Flossenburg arrived with typed lists. Some bore notes from SS camp doctors. After execution, bodies were burned in the crematorium nearby, and names were often erased from camp registry via euphemisms. Relocated, died of illness, or left blank entirely. The victims' identities were often reduced to transport numbers. The role of prisoner functionaries in Station Z was entirely coerced, yet critical. They maintained the speed of procedures, disposed of evidence, and ensured the next group could be processed without delay. This was not mechanical labor. It demanded proximity to death at arm's length on every shift. The SS relied on these prisoners to facilitate an illusion that death could be clean, invisible, and offloaded. Few whistleblowers survived, but 2 separate Soviet POWs managed to escape Sachsenhausen and later reported the method. What took shape in Sachsenhausen would appear elsewhere, in the disguised shooting rooms of Mauthausen, in the surgical-flavored injection zones of Auschwitz, and in the crematoria processes of Birkenau. Station Z was not the most heavily used killing site of the Holocaust, but it was among the most precise. The measuring board and slit behind tile made murder look procedural. It mapped a concept the SS would expand. Kill with no time for protest and clean with hands under command. You leave the room not with a shout or a scream, only the sound of a latch receding in chrome. A stamp hits purple ink. A gallows is hauled onto a Lagerstrasse and bolted upright while the siren pulls men and women into formation. The SS reads out a sentence. A prisoner detail sets the stools and nooses, not stiff with sweat and hemp fibers, and under orders one of them places the loop under a fellow inmate's jaw. Public hangings become ritualized, designed to terrorize the population and to compromise the hands that must prepare them. The line from Station Z folds back into the open air. In July 1943, the shift from hidden execution to staged punishment reached a formal rhythm across the larger camps. Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Majdanek, Gross Rosen. Gallows were no longer temporary scaffolds but repeated fixtures, stored in sheds and wheeled into place on command. Camp authorities used them to broadcast control over life with deliberate choreography. At Auschwitz II Birkenau, wooden gallows with iron bolts were erected in front of the main kitchen or near the women's camp, depending on the audience intended. The siren screamed across commandos, forcing thousands to halt their labor and gather in ranks. On the day of execution, a typed report from the Politische Abteilung outlined the charge: escape attempt, food theft, sabotage, messages passed to civilians. SS officers read the judgment aloud from a prepared sheet, citing violations of Camp Ordnung, then stepped aside. A prisoner detail, previously assigned as carpenters or sanitation workers, brought out stools or crates. Ropes were issued from storage and tied while guards watched the knots. Specific prisoner functionaries, usually designated by armband and prior obedience, were ordered to assist, to position the condemned, fit the rope, kick the stool, or return the body to the cart once slack. You are handed a stool and told when to bring it forward. Another prisoner holds the rope. Under normal rules, touching another inmate was forbidden. Today, it is required. Break the order and you trade places with the condemned. Eyewitness accounts confirm that some prisoners fainted or collapsed. Others moved with mechanical obedience. Few resisted openly. None survived if they did. In memoirs and post-war testimony, the acts are recounted with shock but also detail. The rope fibers, the tension in the crowd, the way bodies jerked against the line. The executions were not in secret. They were made to be remembered. Sometimes they occurred on Jewish religious holidays or before the Sabbath. In women's sections, entire columns of young girls were lined up to watch, some aged 13, 14 made to see the cost of defiance. Photographs exist, gallows with square bases, thick crossbeams, regulation ties. The SS stood to one side. It was the prisoners who placed the instruments and cleaned the blood. By mid-1943, the functionary system was fully integrated into the disciplinary machinery. The same prisoner who served soup or carried infirm inmates to the latrine might next be ordered to hold a noose or count the strokes of a flogging. Gallows executions required fewer bullets, no cartridges to collect, and produced visible fear among the camp population. They also ensured that the prisoners themselves, including those with marginal status or hopes of survival, were made to feel the act tangibly. Death was not only near, it was participatory. The lessons weren't merely for the condemned. They were for the entire block. A man trembling on a box under the gallows wore no special designation. He could have been any one of them. The prisoner who kicked the stool might eat an extra ladle of soup and then report to work the next morning knowing he had helped secure it. The SS no longer had to inflict punishment directly. Their orders moved through armbands, sticks, and silent nods, a logistical system reshaped to include the conscience. You carry a tray of syringes down a corridor that smells of sweat and disinfectant. The revier is full, and the Politische has sent a list. SS medical personnel supervise phenol injections near the heart. Prisoner orderlies restrain limbs and steady chests, or are told to step aside if they hesitate. Killing moves behind the curtain, logged as medical procedure. The gallows and the syringe are different instruments of the same coercion. In the infirmary blocks of Auschwitz I, and other major camps, death wore the language of triage. The revier, nominally a place of healing, was overseen by SS doctors assigned to assess, and when ordered, administer selection. Friedrich Intress, Horst Fischer, and Eduard Wirths were among the officers known to direct phenol injections. They did not hand syringes to nurses. They gave instructions to prisoner functionaries, orderlies, stretcher bearers, and pflegedienst to assist. The routine was razor-thin between procedure and execution. You followed an order or you vanished from the list yourself. The mechanics were precise. A phenol compound, sometimes mixed with alcohol, was drawn into glass syringes with long, heavy-gauge needles. The injection site was the chest, typically between the third and fifth ribs, with an overdose sufficient to induce cardiac arrest within moments. The dosage was determined mechanically, not therapeutically, selected for speed. SS medics observed from behind clipboards, noting the number completed per hour. Prisoner assistants kept the pacing steady, cleaned the needle tips, and disposed of rags soaked in bodily fluids. Hesitation met with instant replacement or reprisal. This strategy, especially prevalent at Auschwitz and Gross Rosen, served two purposes. It eliminated prisoners deemed unfit for labor, from typhus wards, quarantine blocks, surgical rooms, and it removed them from official death records. These killings were rarely recorded as executions. Instead, penciled abbreviations, Herstad heart failure or Plötzlicher Tod sudden death, would appear on charts. Some inmates were pulled directly from barracks without ever passing through a diagnosis. Others were identified from selections during roll call and marked with chalk for pickup. No formal sentence was recorded. You steady a torso as the needle slides in. The man may twitch or he may not. Carbolic acid in the air mutes the next breath of sound. A faint scent of disinfectant competes with the deeper stink of infection and decay in the overcrowded block. The cot is stripped, wiped, and reused within 30 minutes. At Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ravensbrück, similar methods were adapted by camp medical staff. Tile-walled clinics became execution rooms. Blood pits were cut directly into the floor. Testimonies from surviving prisoner nurses describe the mental calculation of identifying which carts to load, which bodies to label, which limbs to lift. There was no formal training for this role, only the threat of reassignment, or worse, if the procedure slowed. The use of inmates in this process was not accidental. It exported technical labor into vulnerable hands and converted the act of killing into a task like any other. No precise count exists of how many were murdered via phenol injections. Estimates at Auschwitz alone placed the number in the tens of thousands by late 1944. In some weeks, dozens were killed per day in a single Revier block. Official SS records remain incomplete or redacted. Most killings left no trace beyond second-hand memory and the rotation of names on a chart. The syringe carried no crowd, no speech, no scaffold, but it required the same complicity under threat. The prisoner functionary, bending over a chest, became another lever in the system. Cloaked in clinical silence, the act was still execution. Where the gallows warned the many, the needle silenced the few, unwitnessed, but no less deliberate. A whistle shrills and you file into a low room where hair clippers buzz. Piles of clothing rise and fall in timed stacks. At Treblinka, Jewish prisoner work crews shear hair, sort valuables, and push jammed doors while Tronicky guards and SS push the flow to the gas chambers. The task list looks administrative but ends at death. The logic of forcing victims to process victims repeats, stripped of choice. Treblinka II, part of Operation Reinhard, functioned without pretense. Unlike Auschwitz, it had no large satellite labor system. It existed for one purpose. From July 1942 to August 1943, it served as the terminus of transports from the Warsaw Ghetto, Bialystok, and other occupied regions of the general government. Transports of 5 to 10 freight cars each arrived daily. Within hours, most of the passengers were dead. The work required to keep the process moving, unclogging chambers, sorting baggage, removing valuables, was done by forced labor prisoners, nearly all of them Jewish men selected upon arrival. You follow the process step by step. Men and women arriving at the Umschlagplatz, the offloading area, were shouted toward a narrow corridor known as the Tube or Himmelweg. Before entry, they passed through undressing yards divided by gender. Along that path, they entered the barber's hut. Here, prisoner workers sheared all hair from the women under SS and Ukrainian guard supervision, shoving piles into sacks that would be baled and shipped for reuse in the Reich's textile industries. The room smelled of sweat, old soap, damp wood, and cut hair. Clippers overheated, scissors dulled, the sound never stopped. No explanations were given. No pleas paused the task. Functionaries within the crew, the Arbeitsjuden, as labeled by the SS, carried numbers, not rights. Their survival depended on absolute compliance under watch. Violators were executed immediately in front of others, sometimes with rifle butts, sometimes inside the clothing sorting yard as the next cohort looked on. Their replacements came from the next incoming transport. The average life expectancy of a work detailer was measured in days or weeks. Functionary groups were rotated or liquidated regularly to prevent knowledge accumulation and resistance. Beyond the barber room, others were forced to perform still closer tasks, removing bodies from gas chambers, hauling them to open pits or cremation pyres, and cleaning chambers for the next convoy. Pit teams dumped buckets of urine and waste from chamber floors scrubbed under whips. Bone crushers pulverized fragments after burning. Each link was treated as necessary, timed, and defined by duty lists written in block script tied to nothing voluntary. Eyewitness testimony by survivors like Chill Rajman describes the rhythm: one chamber emptied, cleaned, another filled, another ready. Time mattered more than body count. The chamber must be ready before the next train arrived. The system at Treblinka allowed no illusions. Work tasks were part of a closed loop from offloading to death, and the SS relied completely on coerced Jewish labor to make the process operate without obstruction. No position was safe. Even the most trusted barbers or sorters were killed and replaced. Survivor accounts describe the moment of retaliation, when guards pulled workmen from lines to shoot as punishment for resistance they had not committed or sabotage they had not planned. A fault in the door, a jammed cart, a delay in shaving could mean execution. The Germans called this self-administration, but it bore no resemblance to autonomy. It was a structure built entirely on the absence of choice, consolidating cruelty into ordered tasks. In documents, the barbers appear as functional categories, not names. In memory, we learn they paused only long enough to pass a glance, steady hands, or shift silently to avoid a blow. At Treblinka, even the moment before death was processed by someone who had no power to stop it. The haircut was not preparation for life. It was the last human gesture allowed before extermination. A shovel blade scrapes bone under wet leaves at Ponnery. Rails are laid as a grate, logs and fuel built into a pyre. Sonderkommando, 1,005 teams, composed of prisoners kept under guard, exhume mass graves and burn the bodies to destroy evidence across occupied Poland and the Baltic. The men who are forced to erase traces know they will be killed. Some cache notes in bottles and tins. The system reaches backward to undo itself, and in doing so leaves more witnesses. In mid-1942, as Allied intelligence sharpened and the Nazi leadership recognized the growing risk of exposure, the RSHA, under instructions from Heinrich Himmler, initiated Action 1005. Carried out under the direction of SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, the operation's objective was to eliminate evidence of mass murder already committed, especially in areas formerly under Einsatzgruppen control. The method was logistical. Graves were to be opened, corpses exhumed, cremated in open pits or pyres, and the ground flattened to mask prior disturbance. This work, deliberately gruesome and prolonged, was assigned to prisoner units under SS and police guard, now reclassified as Sonderkommando 1005. You walk into their world not as choice but as assignment. Selected from nearby ghettos, concentration camps, or as convicts in custody, the prisoners are told little. They are given shovels, picks, fuel, and gloves too thin to matter. In sites like Ponnery near Vilnius, Bykerniki Forest near Riga, Babi Yar near Kiev, and Chelmno in western Poland, the same method unfolds. Work begins under floodlights or in gray pre-dawn mist. Graves previously heaped in haste, often with tens of thousands of decomposing corpses, are reopened with trench tools or by hand, depending on the state of decay. Stench saturates the tools, then skin, then air. Few speak while working. Bodies are hauled onto pyres made from steel rails laid over concrete blocks or mounded stones, layered with brush and petroleum-soaked timber. Often, the corpses are so numerous that they form part of the fuel structure. Lime is added. Ash is raked manually, and bones are crushed with mallets or by rolling barrels over sheets of plywood. Human remains are sifted as if from factory waste for gold fillings, rings, or simply to reach a specified level of pulverization. The targets are not symbolic. They are operational. Instructions list cubic meters of material to destroy. Prisoners sleep in guarded huts or nearby pits, seldom surviving more than a few weeks before being executed themselves. The SS rotates new teams to prevent communication between work crews. At Babi Yar, an August 1943 uprising, poorly armed but sudden, allows a handful of prisoners to escape and later testify. Before this, at Ponary, several have already begun hiding messages. Names, dates, places, written in Yiddish or Polish inked onto wrapping paper, cigarette cartons or clothing tags, waterproofed with animal fat or wax, buried near the sites of the crimes. Official SS documentation of Action 1005 is fragmentary by design. Field orders were largely verbal, committed to notebooks and radio codes now lost or subject to interception. What remains are the testimonies of survivors, intercepted reports from local collaborators, and forensic evidence gathered by Soviet investigation commissions in 1944-1945. Layers of ash, unburned bone, melted fillings. Sonderkommando 1005 did not simply destroy evidence. It added one more tier to the system of enforced complicity. Men whose families were likely among the dead were made to lift, burn, and conceal the remains of others, sometimes under the gaze of those who had committed the original shootings. The logic bore a cruel pretense, erase memory and survival in one stroke, but in their attempt to remove proof, the SS only deepened the record. Bottled documents, ash analysis, survivor testimony. The fire failed to consume everything. The grave tells the story no paper finished. Trucks unload men under cover of night. At the execution site, a prisoner detail cleans blood channels and removes bodies, while an SS man fires from a fixed station. Station Z methods echo here, with prisoners compelled to complete the cycle. In March 1944, a top-secret order circulated from the Reich Main Security Office under Ernst Kaltenbrunner's authority. It was known informally among the SS as the Kugelerlass, or Bullet Decree. Issued months earlier, likely in late 1943, and enforced with greater secrecy by spring of 1944, the directive called for the execution of certain categories of prisoners, primarily recaptured escaped officers from Western nations, Soviet POWs, and those considered intractable or unfit for further interrogation. Instead of returning them to camp populations or civilian courts, these men were to be transferred directly to Mauthausen for secret execution, by a bullet to the back of the neck. Officially, no sentence was recorded. A cover story was prepared. The prisoner had died in transport, fallen during escape, or disappeared due to internal transfer. In reality, they were loaded onto trucks, often in groups of 10 to 30, and transported under Gestapo custody to Mauthausen's bunker area or to a secluded section near the quarry. That night they were processed, stripped of documents, led one by one to a sound-muffled room, and shot at close range by SS personnel stationed behind a fixed partition. You stand outside that space as part of the cleaning detail. Capos assigned to corpse removal, usually drawn from criminal prisoner categories, work with terse instructions. After each shot echoes through the concrete, a door opens and a body is dragged out across a blood channel running beneath the tiles. The groove is rinsed with buckets, and rags are used until none are left unstained. Some of the men avert their eyes, others try not to see at all. No one speaks. The task repeats, for hours. Survivors from the camp who worked in these units and were later spared or transferred testified to the method in post-war investigations. One described the silent rhythm of body after body, the metal scent that never fully rinsed from skin, the sound of boots sliding on wet cement. Victims wore uniforms, spoke French, Dutch, Polish, Russian. Few ever knew where they were or why they had been taken. There were no trials, no appeals. The process reproduced the Station Z model used at Sachsenhausen, a fixed firing slit, a concealed executioner, and the ritual cleaning by prisoner hands operating under SS command. At Mauthausen, the infrastructure was more rugged, adapted to a working quarry, but the logic was identical. Depersonalized death carried out with precision, silence, and full reliance on prisoner labor to remove the human trace. You replace the rags, spread sawdust, lock the body cart wheels, and roll the next into the returning dark. No camp music plays. No commands are shouted. The trucks leave as quietly as they came. The names of the dead are not entered in the ledger. Only the prisoner detail's shift change is marked. The cycle restarts the next night. The Cugelurless operated until the final months of the war. How many died under its provisions remains unclear. Several thousand by best estimates, but uncounted identities vanished with forged documents and false logs. The only irrefutable evidence lies in fragments. Teeth not burned completely, bullets recovered from drainage pits, and the memory of those compelled to be the last witness, made to clean what could not be unremembered. The block bell clangs. A ledger opens to a punishment page. A prisoner functionary reads names while another counts strokes, palm raised and dropped to mark each blow. Flogging posts stand beside gallows in many camps, the procedures timed, witnessed, and recorded by the Schreibstube. Inmates are ordered to assist or to watch from a prescribed distance. The SS keeps their hands on the levers of terror by placing your hands on the tools. Throughout the Nazi concentration camp system, corporal punishment followed strict administrative protocols. At Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück, as well as in dozens of smaller satellite camps, beatings were not random outbreaks of violence. They were sanctioned, scheduled, and orchestrated into the routine apparatus of discipline. The Strafkompanie entries in camp writing rooms logged the infraction, the punishment awarded, and sometimes the outcome. A designated SS officer signed off on the form. The camp doctor, or a prisoner medic under his observation, examined the prisoner both before and after, declaring fitness to endure the punishment. What came next unfolded with ritual exactness. Flogging posts were set into open assembly yards, staked with iron rings at ankle and chest height. The prisoner was stripped to the waist and bound forward, either kneeling or bent. Most often the lash was a wooden cane, a length of rubber hose filled with sand or reinforced whipcord. For severe infractions, such as food theft, speaking to civilians, or refusing orders, 25 strokes was standard. Each blow was counted aloud by a prisoner functionary, often another inmate assigned as lagerdienst, with a palm raised and dropped per strike, ensuring total visibility. You are ordered to raise and lower your hand. Your job is not to strike, only to make the rhythm visible while another prisoner does. If you falter, the SS intervenes. Sometimes they take over, more often they replace you. The role is not chosen. It is assigned. Once given, it rarely changes. The SS rarely delivered the punishment themselves. Instead, they scanned the formation for capos or Blockeltest willing to execute orders. Some functionaries, especially from criminal categories, employed extreme brutality. Others varied in their severity, delivering the minimum under threat of denunciation. Survivor accounts differ. Some remember sadism. Others describe trembling hands forced through the task, visibly traumatized. Always it was the SS who authorized, oversaw, and remained distant. The beatings gave the appearance of inmate governance while retaining total SS control. Prisoners were also forced to observe. Proximity was deliberate. Witnesses stood 10 paces away in precise ranks. No speaking, no movement. Survivors recall the sound of breathlessness, the thud of the cane, the moment of collapse. Blood-spattered stone. Sometimes the victim was carried away unconscious, placed in a barrack corner or left outside depending on the severity of the injuries or the mood of the guards. Occasionally, the punishment proved fatal. Official logbooks noted heart failure or shot while fleeing, when bodies were discovered dead hours afterward. You walk past the flogging post later that evening. The ring still glistens from water thrown to rinse the blood away. The cane leans in the corner of a silent Schreibstube office, already listed for use tomorrow. In this system, punishment wasn't about correction, but hierarchy. The post reaffirmed who could strike and who must count. The SS extended its reach by forcing prisoners to mimic its power, delegated brutality in exchange for another day of bread or a thicker coat. Some found obscure ways to soften the blow. Others could not. The camp bore no interest in mercy, only in order. And order in this machinery was spelled out one stroke at a time. You turn a winch that raises an elevator. Muffled thumps mark the rhythm as bodies are moved from chambers below to ovens above. At Birkenau's crematoria IIV, Sonderkommando units of Jewish prisoners are forced to retrieve corpses, extract gold teeth under SS supervision, and feed multi-muffle ovens designed by Topf und Cern. Some testimonies describe rare moments when a living person is found among the dead. The SS orders the killing finished. This is the closest the system comes to forcing prisoners to complete death itself. At the heart of Auschwitz II Birkenau, between the zigzag lines of electrified fencing and barracks swarmed with lice and silence, stood crematoria II and III, mirror image buildings constructed with German precision. Each complex had gas chambers and undressing rooms set partially underground, connected by a corridor, with freight elevators leading to the upper level where the ovens lined the walls in orderly rows. These were not improvised sites. They were engineered installations, designed by Topf und Cern for mass throughput. Crematorium III alone was capable of incinerating more than 1,000 bodies in 24 hours. Its 8 three-muffle ovens stoked continuously by Sonderkommando under threat of death for hesitation or errors. The labor division was brutally efficient. Before each gassing, Sonderkommando prisoners were ordered to clear the undressing area, arrange the collected belongings, and keep the intake process quiet. The gassings themselves were conducted solely by SS men, usually inserting Zyklon B through vent shafts, sealing the doors. When the sound stopped and the air cleared, the Sonderkommando waited behind the chamber doors until instructed. Then they entered with face rags and hooks. Bodies were tangled, sometimes clawed together in the dark. The first task was to untangle the piles, search for jewelry or gold teeth, and shave hair from the scalps of women. You follow the line up the freight elevator, lifting 15 to 20 bodies in a metal lift to the oven floor. There, the corpses are arranged, staggered, to facilitate air flow, on iron stretchers slid into the muffles by pairs of prisoners. Coke is shoveled by muscle memory. Ash is scraped, bones crushed mechanically. Dockets for each load are held by SS supervisors who track productivity. The Sonderkommando are watched at all times, often separated from other prisoners. They sleep near the crematoria, fed slightly better to maintain strength, but rotated out by execution after a few months. Some testimony, like that of Philip Müller and Henrik Tauber, demolishes any illusion of procedural detachment. The chamber floor after a gassing is slick. Bodies of children pile atop mothers. Some cry out. On rare occasions, the doors open before death is complete. Gas lingered unevenly, or the dose was insufficient. Orders are immediate. The living are to be killed. Prisoners are forced to drag, smother, or bludgeon under SS orders. Such moments are rarely written. Many survivors speak of them only after decades of silence. Communication with the outside camp is forbidden. Attempts to write, often in secret buried notes wrapped in oilcloth, describe fixed routines, minor resistance, tragedies witnessed without end. The Sonderkommando write not to inform, but to survive beyond their life expectancy. Crematoria IV and V face the same procedures, variants in structure but not in logic. Trains arrive, gas is released, elevators rise, ovens burn, ash is dumped in rivers or fields made of bone. Here, the system exhausts its power to mechanize death. The SS do not touch the dead. They touch the trigger, then point. The hands that prepare the bodies, load the ovens, rake the ash. They all belong to men who know their days are numbered, and who sometimes find tools hidden in clothing or a note from another shift. No detail is unmonitored. Death moves on rails, lifts by winch, and cools as cinders beneath the birch trees. A rusted tobacco tin breaks the clay near the ruins of crematorium III. Inside are smudged pages on fragile paper. The writings of Zalman Gradowski, Zalman Leuenthal, and others, buried in 1944 and found from 1945 into the 1960s, record tasks and timings, the names of guards, and the way coercion worked shift by shift. These notes anchor what survivors later recalled. They also show what was unknown even then, and what was too dangerous to write. What the SS tried to classify out of history, the Sonderkommando tried to preserve with pencil and ash. Throughout 1944, as the gas chambers at Birkenau operated at peak capacity, several Jewish prisoners forced to work in crematoria, IIV, began writing their testimonies on anything salvageable. Stolen paper, cement wrappers, packing slips, report margins. The text was scrawled in Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, and shorthand, records of what they saw, what they endured, and what they feared would disappear if they were murdered before speaking. Zalman Gradowski, a Polish Jew deported from Bialystok, emerged as one of the clearest chroniclers. His narrative, part diary and part final statement, included estimates of transports, notes on how victims were deceived, and reflections written on the verge of collapse. Wrapped in oilskins or welded tins, these fragments were buried in ash pits adjacent to the crematoria ruins, often under threat of immediate execution if caught. In one scroll unearthed in 1945, the hand still shakes in the final lines. He knew he would not survive. You read, "We worked as they stood as we buried under orders." Leuenthal, similarly, wrote of the periodic liquidation of Sonderkommando units, those who had worked too long, seen too much, or smuggled a glance. His writing bears stains from ash and grease, the language compressed by urgency. In one passage, he tries to explain how they sang without voices, resisting with memory because action was impossible. Each sentence is stitched with the knowledge that their words, not their bodies, would have to defy oblivion. The buried notes do not report heroism. They record sterile repetition. How many to a load, how many minutes per gassing cycle, what shifts of prisoners handled what rooms. They name SS men and collaborating Tronicky guards. They describe silence enforced by eyes rather than orders. Their testimony fills in what legal records omit, the rhythm of being forced to wash corpses of those they might once have known. The decision to write was not just a moral act. It was an act of theft from the system that tried to erase the last evidence of its crimes. Some of the scrolls remained hidden for decades. In 1962, a construction crew digging near crematorium III uncovered another canister. Inside, writing barely survived, refined with ultraviolet light, reconstructed word by word. The pages had long since absorbed the chemicals of decay, but the narrative held. These are not anonymous records. Names fill the margins. The writers knew that no graves marked their place, so they placed their identities into tin, earth, and hope. The scrolls expose more than horrors. They show omissions. Whole paragraphs are left blank, events too dangerous to write or too impossible to explain in the words at hand. There's a list of names abrupt with no context. Men selected, then gone. No closure. Only the knowledge that this document might outlive them. The SS left ledgers. The Sonderkommando left fragments. One preserved voice marks the time of day a convoy arrived, while another notes how a child's shoes looked, laid beside the chamber door. These writings never shout. They whisper from beneath scorched ground. At Birkenau, the dead do not speak in epitaphs. They speak through the hands that wrote amid ash in the few moments between gas, fire, and silence. A siren cuts the afternoon. Smoke boils from crematorium IV as Sonderkommando resist liquidation, using gunpowder smuggled by women from the Union munitions factory. SS units close in with rifles and machine guns. The building is set ablaze, several SS are killed, and hundreds of prisoners are shot in and around the Birkenau crematoria. The revolt is crushed by evening. It marks the moment when those nearest the killing machinery refuse to be its last victims. In the preceding weeks, rumors had spread among the Sonderkommando units at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Crematoria were running continuously. Transports from Hungary had intensified, and SS discipline had become more erratic. Certain names on the Sonderkommando team list stopped appearing. Prisoners knew what it meant. Previous rotations had ended with the mass killing of entire work details. Now, with the Eastern Front drawing near, it became clear that the Nazis were preparing to destroy the remaining witnesses. The Sonderkommando decided they would not go quietly. The revolt was planned in silence, anchored in acts of defiance invisible to most. Inside the Union munitions factory within the Auschwitz labor complex, several Jewish women, Rosa Roboda, Ala Gertner, Estuja Wajblum, and Regina Safferstagen, began smuggling minute quantities of gunpowder to the Birkenau sector. Each act was a risk. The powder was concealed in scraps of cloth, hidden in the linings of garments or under fingernails, passed hand to hand across locks and fences, accumulating over weeks until enough could be packed into makeshift detonators. At 3 p.m. on October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando assigned to crematorium IV struck. Explosives were set beneath the infrastructure, and as the first blast echoed across the yard, prisoners set fire to the building and attacked SS guards with stones, hammers, and stolen tools. Others broke through fences or tried to flee toward the Birkenau perimeter. One SS man was thrown into the fire. Others were injured before guard units arrived with submachine guns. The entire site became an open-air battle under the shadow of smoke and rifle fire. You run behind the crematorium wall, but the way is blocked. Few escape. Roughly 250 Sonderkommando are killed on the spot. More are captured, interrogated, and executed in the coming days. In January 1945, the 4 women involved in smuggling the gunpowder are hanged in public near the women's camp roll call square, made to serve as a final warning about resistance. The last pages written by men in the Sonderkommando speak of the rising preparations for revolt but remain vague, either by necessity or instinct. They had no illusions of survival. The revolt was not an effort to change the war's course or to escape. It was an attempt to leave behind a mark that the system couldn't erase. Crematorium IV was damaged beyond repair and never returned to operation. The act delayed final executions and ensured that the machinery of death was not invincible. This was the only large-scale armed uprising by Sonderkommando units in the extermination camps, and no archive written by the SS acknowledges the revolt in detail. It exists because prisoners remembered it, wrote about it while dying, and bore its risk together. From the women who passed the powder to the men who lit the fire, October 7 was a refusal, not just to die, but to disappear. Frost cuts the lungs, boots slide on ice. A capo swings a rubber truncheon to keep columns moving toward railheads and roads. Evacuations from Auschwitz, Stutthof, Grossrosen, and dozens of smaller subcamps scatter prisoners across hundreds of kilometers. Beatings and roadside shootings replace formal gallows. The functionary system migrates onto the road. The order is spoken rather than stamped, but the result is the same. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached the Vistula River line, the SS issued instructions, most oral, a few coded, to liquidate key camps and move selected prisoner populations westward. Formal documents authorizing these evacuations are fragmentary. Most decisions were made via frontline orders, telephone call, or courier. Commandants at Auschwitz, Gleiwitz, and other sites assembled columns of prisoners, separated by category and labor utility, and assigned SS escorts with defined patrol sectors. By then, camp infrastructure no longer held. Paths of ice replaced Appellplatz squares, and collapsed fences merged the inside with the outside world. You begin moving before daybreak. A capo, once a block elder in Birkenau, now assigned to supervise this column of 500 men, holds a baton cut from a broom handle. He reinforces pace with strikes, not always lethal, but always enough to keep bodies upright. The prisoners carry rags for shoes and blankets soaked through by sleet. Every few kilometers, the line buckles, someone falls. The SS orders the capos to restore movement. Those who cannot continue are shot beside the road or left where they collapse. Eyewitnesses later describe piles of 2 or 3 bodies every few hundred meters, half covered by snow or left to frost solid by dawn. By this stage of the war, the distinction between functionary and target blurs further. Some capos have been prisoners for years, promoted inside walls they thought would never fall. Others were appointed in haste, men handed authority and truncheons minutes before leaving camp. A few used their positions to distribute stolen bread or arrange rest. Others used them for absolution or cruelty. Survivor testimony diverges, but the system remains constant: guard, strike, deliver, walk or die. The SS controls direction, prisoner functionaries enforce momentum. The marches span across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Sudetenland, toward camps like Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. Transports meant to last 2 days stretch into weeks. Food is issued sporadically: frozen bread, bone broth, or nothing. Water comes from road ditches or snow. Requests for medical help are ignored. Even SS escorts begin to desert in places, leaving prisoner columns guarded solely by armed capos, some wearing parts of uniforms scavenged from barracks days before. You grip a fellow prisoner's shoulder, helping him over a frozen culvert. A capo cracks a whip over your back but does not shoot. Another prisoner behind you is not as fortunate. His body is dragged to the side of the road and abandoned. Somewhere behind you, dogs bark and another column approaches. You count hours by breath and distance by pain. Orders are no longer written down, only shouted forward. Estimates place the number of prisoners forced on death marches at over 250,000 in the final months of the war. Tens of thousands were killed en route, by bullet, exposure, starvation, or despair. No full list of participants exists. Records shattered under snow, bullets, and ash. The SS destroyed files. Capos vanished into civilian clothes or lay among the dead, indistinguishable now. The system ended as it had operated, dragging its victims by force into silence, with prisoners pressed into power for another hour, another kilometer, until no one could walk further. You walk with a liberating unit past oven doors and hooks embedded in beams. Notebooks appear, names are taken, and prisoner functionaries are separated for questioning. The U.S. 7th Army at Dachau, the Red Army at Auschwitz, and the British at Bergen-Belsen document structures and procedures, photographing gallows, injection rooms, and disguised shooting stations. Survivors point out where selections took place, where stunt gallows stood, where functionaries gave orders beneath SS supervision. Liberation brings light, but with it judgment. By April 1945, Allied armies crossing into Germany and Poland uncover not only mass graves and skeletal survivors, but complex systems of delegated power. Liberators do not yet have the language for what they're seeing. Crematoria designed with industrial drawings, barracks books showing prisoner hierarchies, punishment registers listing armband colors instead of names. Initial reports by British and American intelligence mention prisoner policemen or privileged categories. Red Army officers documenting Auschwitz find survivors weak, some barely speaking, but able to point to those who had carried truncheons or were seen counting lashes. In the hours after liberation, chaos reigns. At Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, starving survivors attack some of the men they remember as abusive capos. In other places, reprisal is more measured. Military officers, doctors, and war correspondents begin taking statements. Functionaries are instructed to step forward voluntarily or are identified by other prisoners. Some wear their armbands still. Others have removed them or tried to vanish among the general population. The lines blur. Some capos were brutal for survival, others exploited the system with zeal. Liberators carry no uniform policy. At Dachau in late April, American forces conduct preliminary interrogations. Notebook pages filled by counterintelligence officers record prisoner testimony, details of beatings, lists of names, and camp routines. At Auschwitz in January, Red Army units had arrived too quickly to find many functionaries alive. Most had been sent on death marches or already executed by the SS. At Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers find dozens of functionaries still in place, working in delousing, field kitchens, or corpse disposal teams under SS guard, some now trying to serve as interpreters or intermediaries. Testimonies vary. So do acts of mercy and reprisal. You see one man kneeling, not resisting, while others surround him, shouting that he gave orders during flogging. A nearby officer intervenes. Another man, accused of collaboration, is handed a broom and ordered to start clearing the dead. Roles invert rapidly. Justice is still confused with rage, and records are thin. No tribunal yet exists. No files have been consolidated. A war is still raging. Across the liberated camps, documents are gathered, transport logs, Sonderkommando notes, punishment books, death registers. But many stories are carried first by breath, not paper. Soldiers and prosecutors must work backward, from bones found in ovens to the hands that fed them, from names shouted at roll call to armbands issued in exchange for survival. The tools of judgment, photographic evidence, camp maps, survivor affidavits, begin to assemble a portrait of a system more complex than a simple list of victims and perpetrators. Liberation ends captivity. But for the prisoner functionaries caught between those categories, it brings the beginning of another reckoning. Were they criminals or coerced? Witnesses or enforcers? When no one asked for the job and not taking it meant death, what responsibility remained? The first questions are shouted. The second require years, and the answers do not always survive the silence that followed. A gavel falls in a small courtroom. Files from Krakow, Frankfurt, and Tel Aviv are stacked with statements about armbands, sticks, and orders delivered at dawn. Post-war courts in Poland and West Germany try SS and civilian perpetrators. Israel's Nazi and Nazi collaborators law brings several capo cases under scrutiny, weighing duress against acts. Verdicts vary by jurisdiction and evidence. The law wrestles with a system designed to blur moral lines. Between 1945 and the early 1960s, national courts across Europe, and later in Israel, faced the unprecedented task of untangling personal responsibility from systemic coercion. In Poland, early trials unfolded under Soviet-aligned tribunals, including the 1947 Krakow proceedings against former Auschwitz personnel. While these focused primarily on SS officers and guards, prisoner functionaries were not exempt from scrutiny. Testimonies from fellow inmates named former capos suspected of extreme violence, especially those from the Green Triangle criminal category. But records were often scarce, identities uncertain, and motivations unclear. In West Germany, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, 1963-1965, revisited these roles with more legal structure. The focus remained on SS perpetrators, but several prisoner functionaries were mentioned in testimony. Prosecutors were faced with legally and ethically complex questions. Can a prisoner who struck another under threat of death be considered a perpetrator? Was a capo with privileges acting freely or under duress? Defense teams argued coercion. Survivors on the stand told stories of beatings, ordered roll calls, names reported to the SS. You sit in the courtroom in Tel Aviv during the 1951 trial of Hirsch Barenblatt, a former capo accused under Israel's 1950 Nazi and Nazi collaborators, punishment law. Unlike in Germany or Poland, where functionaries were seen within the broader Nazi system, Israeli courts considered them as part of an occupied Jewish community. The law carried the weight of memory. Verdicts were not always unanimous. Barenblatt was initially found guilty, then acquitted on appeal due to evidence of coercion. Each trial attempted to define justice in a system built to resist clarity. The Nazi apparatus pushed violence downward, outsourcing enforcement to prisoners whose only alternatives were death, degradation, or replacement. Some functionaries abused their power. Others tried to mitigate harm. The courts had to draw lines where the camps had erased them. The result was a patchwork. Some were jailed, others walked free, still others disappeared into post-war anonymity. The legal record today reflects more about the camp's inescapable moral gray zones than it does neat resolutions. For every verdict delivered, another case was left without trial, names forgotten, locations untraceable. Justice was not only about proof. It was about the possibility of accountability in a system engineered to destroy the very conditions that made choice possible. A label sits next to a length of rope. An audio guide clicks in the preserved execution area at Buchenwald's crematorium, where hooks still mark beams. Sachsenhausen Station Z stands as a reconstructed corridor. Auschwitz's Block 11 courtyard and the ruins of Birkenau's crematoria are mapped with panels that trace prisoner roles. Museums emphasize hierarchy and compulsion while naming individual SS. Many of the prisoner assistants remain anonymous on the walls. Since the 1950s, and especially after the 1970s, memorial sites built at former concentration and extermination camps have faced the challenge of presenting complexity without losing clarity. The role of prisoner functionaries, Blockeltest, Kapos, Sonderkommando, complicates the binary of victim and perpetrator. Curators must walk a narrow path, placing these functionaries within the machinery of death, acknowledging their actions, without equating them to the architects of the system that gave them no humane choices. At Buchenwald, the preserved crematorium contains physical evidence. Original hooks used for hangings carried out by SS orders, prepared and often facilitated by prisoner work details. Visitor signage explains the procedural nature of executions, the presence of inmate assistants, and the hierarchy imposed by the SS. The names of executed victims are listed fully. SS perpetrators are named, but functionary roles are described in general terms, tasks, not names. Ethical caution drives this. Many records are fragmentary, testimonies conflicting, and the line between survival and complicity resistant to black and white interpretation. You walk into the reconstructed Genexschussenlage at Sachsenhausen, Station Z's next shooting station, through a corridor of tile and chrome that echoes with artificial stillness. Signage explains who designed it, who fired the gun from behind the slit, and how the procedure unfolded. The prisoner barbers, cleaners, and body handlers are mentioned only as part of work details. Few appear by name, not intentionally forgotten, often simply unrecorded. At Auschwitz, curators have taken a different approach. Block 11's preserved courtyard is marked with the black wall used for executions by firing squad. Functionary roles are included on interpretive panels, with documents from the Schreibstube and testimonies from Sonderkommando used to show the layered responsibilities. Survivor accounts, when available, are quoted or paraphrased, not as endorsements or condemnation, but as living memory. Increasingly, exhibitions stress the impossibility of choice inherent in prisoner self-administration. Much of this evolution came after decades of silence. For years, museums avoided the topic of Jewish functionaries and Sonderkommando, fearing misinterpretations. Only after the publication and careful analysis of survivor memoirs, interviews, and recovered scrolls did memorial institutions begin engaging more fully with these roles, still carefully, still aware of the moral terrain. In some rooms, names are absent not because they were erased, but because they were never recorded. A truncheon hangs in a case. The caption reads, "Used by prisoner functionaries under SS order." Which hands used it remains unknown. The museum leaves room for acknowledgement but avoids unverified claims. The challenge remains open. How do we remember those made to serve the machinery that also targeted them? How do we speak about roles that could shift by the week, by coercion, or by hunger? Through architecture, preserved sites, and fragments of testimony, museums now attempt to represent the functionary system with honesty, neither glorifying nor erasing, restoring human ambiguity to a machine that was designed to strip it away. A ledger ends mid-page. A prisoner badge with a truncated name lies in a display case. The archive request returns with gaps. Thousands forced into execution details were killed before liberation or disappeared into post-war displacement. We know procedures better than we know people. Who records the names of the men ordered to pull the stool away? In the post-war years, documentation of the Holocaust became a race between memory and erasure. Millions of pages of captured German records, depositions from survivors, and photographs taken by liberators formed the backbone of what would become the historical narrative. But within these archives, the names and fates of prisoner functionaries, especially those forced into roles involving executions, beatings, or cremation, often remain missing or obscured, not by malice, but by design. The camp system was built for throughput, not biography. Entry registers listed prisoner numbers and nationalities, not full life stories. Functionary appointments, who became a capo, a Blockaltister, or Sonderkommando, were often documented only in temporary work assignments, easily altered, often destroyed, and not uniformly preserved. After liberation, many of the trusted prisoners who participated in or witnessed the killing process were marched westward and killed in transit. Others died of disease in the final days or merged into displaced populations without the chance or the will to speak. You visit an archive. You request records for a name mentioned in passing in a survivor testimony. He used to carry the bodies, or he was the one who cut the rope afterward. The file is missing, or it was never opened. A number appears in a labor roster for 1 week, then vanishes. Sometimes a survivor remembers a name but not a face. Sometimes the reverse. Trauma fractures recollection. And the system knew that would happen. Some testimonies mention acts of mercy, extra food, warnings whispered before selections. Others speak of blunt cruelty, but the context is almost always incomplete. No one saw every shift, every act, every order whispered under SS watch. A capo in January may have been a corpse handler by March. Roles changed, armbands reassigned, judgments made under conditions most courts are not equipped to reconstruct. Museums now mount exhibitions with caution. Trial documents are revisited. Survivor interviews digitized. But for each known figure, Zalman Gradowski, Philip Mueller, there are hundreds whose stories remain fragmented. The tobacco tin notes recovered from Birkenau contain partial names, initials, nicknames, and first-person plural sentences. We buried, we carried, we burned. Rarely I. The final cruelty of the functionary system was its silencing effect. It drafted victims into its apparatus, used their hands, then erased their names, with bullets, with disease, with humiliation too deep for post-war telling. Even the act of pulling the stool was built to remain anonymous, an action without a witness, a role without a memorial. We study the orders, the architecture, the procedures. We can map where the rope was tied. But the name of the man who placed it, under fear or numbness or resigned survival, often disappears before we find his number. In the end, a system designed to depersonalize succeeded on both sides. It hid its perpetrators, but it also swallowed those it compelled to become its instruments. The question remains not just for historians. It stays with every visitor who sees a rope enclosed in glass, who walks a corridor between walls of names that never include the ones asked to clean up after the last breath had left the room. The machinery is still visible, but the hands are mostly gone.